right? So this is beyond the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, right? We want to move beyond the oppressor-oppressed contradiction. He has a beautiful section where he says something along the lines that the new human being is neither oppressed nor oppressor, right? This new individual, after the act of liberation, is neither an oppressed person, a member of an oppressed class, nor an oppressor, or a member of the oppressor's class. It's just a human being. Just a human being like you, just a human being like me, right? People who bleed, people who love, people who eat, people who starve, people who have emotions, people who have wants, people who have desires, and so on. A recognition, it really is, right? When people talk about activism and peace and all of this stuff, it really is as simple as recognizing an individual for their humanity. That's it. You don't need all this logic, you don't need all the theory, you don't need all the big words, you don't need anything else. All you really need is a recognition that this human being is exactly like me. And that's as profound as it gets. Unfortunately, it's easier said than done. Okay. The other point to move beyond this oppressor-oppressed contradiction, this requires the destruction of the oppressor class, right? Through the act of revolt, right? In order for us to get beyond, right? In order for us to transcend this, right? In order for us to transcend this into a state of affairs where you just have sort of individuals living amongst each other, right? Wherein we all have relationships with each other and all those relationships are equal, sort of like this. It doesn't have to be as hokey as egalitarianism, but in which, you know, power isn't as abused and it isn't used in such a structurally dominating sense as in the oppressor paradigm. In order for us to transcend this, right, there has to be a destruction of the oppressor group, right? The oppressor class needs to be destroyed, right? And destroyed on an ontological sense, right? You need to obliterate the being of the necessary existence of a group of people who function to oppress some other group of people. That needs to be obliterated. Not human beings, but the conceptual validity that their existence has, right? We need to deny that validity and say that that validity has no validity, and show why there isn't a validity to that claim. This act of destruction is not an act of oppression. As we said, it's not an act of oppression, and it's also not an act of violence in the proper sense, right? Not an act of violence in the use of oppression, right? Which really makes sense. You sort of see how that's interchangeable. Next point, oppression can only occur in the act of dehumanization. We talked about that. The existence of the oppressive class dehumanizes the oppressed, right? The very existence of this class is a sufficient condition. It is in itself sufficient. It's enough. It's complete to dehumanize this class. So if you think about it, right? The existence, the fact that, and I don't want to get too philosophical, but the very fact that the existence of this class is possible, exists, has status in the world, requires, right, in itself, it's sufficient, the dehumanization of some other group. And what does that mean? Well, if I classify myself as the oppressor, and I'm a member of the oppressor class, then the only way that I can be a member of the oppressor class is there's people that are subordinate to me, right? So it doesn't matter who those people are, right? It'll be you, it'll be you. If I kill all those off, it'll be somebody else. We'll continually manufacture populations to be subordinated, right? We'll continually manufacture populations to be subjugated and oppressed. There will always be, on an ontological level, a sufficient need to have, right? The existence of this is sufficient for the existence of an oppressed class. So as long as we're talking, and as long as we've situated the discourse within the context of the OOC sort of dilemma, then we're going to have oppression and dehumanization. Next bullet point, the destruction of the oppressive class liberates the oppressed from dehumanization. And we see this, right? I've used this term, sort of just created it, rehumanization, right? The attempt to liberate oneself from this act of oppression is an attempt to regain the humanity that was once robbed, right? And that is obviously not an act of oppression. It's obviously not an act of dehumanization. I should put it down right. This revolt, so the revolt is not an act of violence, not an act of oppression. Also, not an act of and obviously the converse is true here. This is an act of dehumanization, this is an act of violence, this is an act of oppression. So, sort of the distinction between. Therefore, the act of destroying the oppressive class, right, the act of destroying the act of destroying the oppressive class cannot be an act of oppression, since it ultimately liberates human beings from further dehumanization, right? It cannot be an act of violence, it cannot be an act of oppression, it cannot be an act of dehumanization, because it attempts to give humanity, right? It attempts to ascribe humanity to those who had for so long been robbed of any recognition, right? That is the point of the revolt, right? And as I've said in earlier videos, we have, I'll abbreviate DH as dehumanization and H as humanity. We have the attempt to oppress individuals, the act of oppression, the act of violence, the act of dehumanization, in the creation of, dehumanization, should be the other way, should be this way, right? The act of oppression, the act of violence, the act of dehumanization, to create a class of dehumanized people, right? You're not entitled to the same things that we are entitled to. And this is an act of revolt, right? The act of revolt. The act of revolt, like the act of dehumanization, may incorporate some aspects of violence, but even if it incorporates an act of violence, it's not the same, it's not to be understood in the same sense in which we say violence as the violence of the oppressor, because this violence is used specifically to regain, what I would say, rehumanize those who were formerly dehumanized. Okay. The next point pertains to consequences of liberation for the former oppressor, right? What are the consequences for the oppressor in the liberation of a group, right? Insofar as the oppressed population now has attained liberation, has attained their freedom, what are the consequences for those who used to be the oppressors, right? So I'll put consequences for former so consequences for former oppressors. First, there is no sense of liberation among former oppressors. Any person who was an oppressor before isn't going to feel liberated, because now the oppressor is thinking to himself, I'm now like you, right? I don't have power over you, right? So what we're talking about specifically is after the revolt. When we revisit this oppressor class, what we'll see is that we'll have a transition into a state of affairs that is more like this, right? Where you have to recognize me for the human being that I am. There isn't a level of subordination. I'm not lower or worse than you. I'm on par with who you are, right? We're the same human beings, right? But what they're going to envision this as, the consequence of this liberation, is that I think that I've lost something, right? What have I lost? Well, I've obviously lost the right to oppress you. So automatically, on a very sort of fundamental level, you see that there is definitely going to be the perception of loss among the oppressor population, because the oppressor population is going to think, I used to be able to subordinate these people and I can't do that anymore, right? I can't do that, so I feel a sense of loss.